Module 13, a case study of a good teacher turns bad. What do we know? We know that Crestview is one of 3 elementary schools in a rural school district. Mrs. Wilson is in her 3rd year of principal, and at the school they have good community and parent support, attendance is good, and grades and test scores are high. We know that Mrs. Horton is a 1st grade teacher. She has been former teacher of the year, and she's a seasoned professional, so she has been teaching for a while. We know that Mr. Stafford is a parent of a student that has a complaint and is not happy with things that are going on in the school with his daughter, Julie. What we also know, we know that Mrs. Wilson noticed that Mrs. Horton's behavior had changed towards the end of the school year, that she just seemed to not be herself, she had noticed, and that she learned from another colleague that Mrs. Horton was having a difficult time at home, that her husband had just recently left and she was home alone to raise 2 sons. And then came the summer, so Mrs. Wilson was hoping that through the summer that come back to the new school year that the issues had been resolved. But as the school year started, everything seemed to be going smoothly, but she still had noticed some differences in Mrs. Horton. Mrs. Horton was conspicuously absent. She was not there during the summer vacations, holidays to get the classroom and things prepared. Mrs. Horton started a new reading program at the beginning of the school year that she wanted to pilot, and Mrs. Horton was not on board with this, disagreed with the reading program. She got kind of angry or disgruntled with some of the teachers that did support this, and Mrs. Wilson did have a talk with Mrs. Horton, but that didn't seem to resolve those issues. We also know that the principal received, Mrs. Wilson received some letters and phone calls from other parents on different things that had happened in the school and were not happy with Mrs. Horton. And we also know that the superintendent called Mrs. Wilson and told her that the Board of Education had had some complaints from parents and wanted their children removed from the classroom. Other things that we know is that Mr. Stafford, who is the father of Julie, who is in Mrs. Horton's class, was very upset with Mrs. Horton. He replied that Julie cried every day, did not want to go to school, that she yelled at them, so that his wife had been trying to get a hold of Mrs. Horton and sent her phone calls that not returned, that she wanted to do a parent-teacher conference. So Mr. Stafford went to the school and talked to Mrs. Wilson and told him that he demanded a parent-teacher conference because he wanted Julie to be out of the classroom. So Mrs. Wilson had a parent-teacher conference with Mrs. Horton and Mr. Stafford the next day. When Mr. Stafford came to the parent-teacher conference, Mrs. Horton was not prepared. She didn't have suitable seating for him. She got up during the parent-teacher conference to look at Julie's papers and test scores and those kinds of things, and he was very frustrated with this. When he then started talking about his frustrations and complaints with Mrs. Horton about what he felt that he had heard from Julie, that she had been yelling at the kids, that she was verbally abusive, and that she made them get up in the middle of the room and feel embarrassed. And as soon as that happened, Mrs. Horton got very defensive and kind of got a little loud and angry with him. So Mrs. Wilson ended the conversation and said that we will have to get back with Mr. Stafford to get a decision on what to do with Julie in the classroom. What do I think that we need to know? I think that we need to know a little bit more background on Mrs. Horton and what was going on in the situation. She just had hearsay from another colleague about the issues that Mrs. Horton was having at home. I think we need to know specifically what the children are saying and going home and telling their parents. We need to know what types of supports are available if it is, in fact, Mrs. Horton is going through some difficult times. What are supports for her, as well as what are some supports for the children if they are dealing with some different things in the classroom and going home and telling their parents. I think we need to know what the protocol is for dealing with parents that are upset. We need to know like what the contract for teachers say and negotiated agreement as far as dealing with these types of situations, and which goes in hand with then what is the action plan or disciplinary action plan that goes along with these types of situations. So what I think the problem is there's obviously some unsatisfactory behavior with Mrs. Horton. So the plan of action, first I would want to communicate with the superintendent, let him or her know what had happened during the parent-teacher conference. Make sure and document everything that happened during the parent-teacher conference and of course up until this time. I would want to then next refer to the school and district negotiated agreement, see what that says about disciplinary action. Fourth, I would plan to have a leave of absence for Mrs. Horton and hire a long-term sub. If this is not able to do on such notice, we would hire a sub that the classroom or the kids are familiar with until we can get a long-term sub, and then make a plan with Mrs. Horton. As far as to resolve the issue and what I think is best for the students, we need to talk to the students or the next day, or when the sub comes in the room. Of course, not giving them too much information, but getting them enough information that maybe Mrs. Horton is going to be gone for a little while. I don't think that they, especially first graders, need to know all the details, but just that she will be gone for a while, that this would be the teacher in the classroom for a while. The substitute also needs to continue with the routine and the structure of the classroom so that the students still feel comfortable and feel safe at where they're at. As the principal, I or Mrs. Horton or Mrs. Wilson, would want to do daily walkthroughs through the classroom just to see how the children in the classroom are dealing with the change and dealing with things in the classroom. And then, of course, communicate with parents because the school has a great communication with parents. As it stated at the beginning, I would want to make sure and let all the parents in this classroom kind of know just the basics of what's going on with keeping confidentiality, that Mrs. Horton will be gone for a while and that we will have a stub for the time being. As far as reflecting on the situation, I think that we need to look at the effects of trauma. With that being said, I also think that Mrs. Wilson needed to talk to Mrs. Horton from the very beginning to see kind of what was going on in the situation, what was going on as far as the things that she had heard, kind of start from the beginning and be involved in the situation. I think that looking at self-care is a big thing right now in schools, in education. Are there self-care programs or things going on in the school to help teachers just manage day-to-day life, day-to-day teaching, those kinds of things? I feel that the principal did support the teacher, that at the beginning, when she had some parents call and complain, that she replied to them that, she hadn't seen any of the behavior, that she had been in and out of the classroom and did not see any of the behavior that the parents were talking about, that she did want to have a parent-teacher conference before just removing Julie from the classroom, and that I do feel like that having routine and consistency in the classroom is very important. Some of my values is that the support, again, for the teacher. I think it's important to support your teachers as a principal, to kind of know you have their back. But I also think that, having that teacher-principal relationship is important. I also think that it is important to know that parents can come and voice, opinions or voice concerns with the principal. I think you need to have that open communication. As far as some unresolved issues, there's obviously some unresolved issues with the relationship between the teacher and the principal. There was just kind of something missing, I felt there at the very, at the end of the school year when the principal had noticed some behavior changes in the teacher. The principal did not ever approach the teacher. She kind of got hearsay from people, and just kind of, it was close to the end of the school year, so just kind of wanted to get through the school year. I think maybe that she needed to approach the teacher from the get-go and see what's going on. Then to see like kind of some of the underlying issues of the change of behavior as far as what was going on and why this behavior has changed, because the teacher was like, you know, teacher of the year, very good teacher up until this point of time. And then I would like to know, you know, it kind of talked earlier about how she had kind of started being late to school, but I would like to know the attendance and the test scores of the kids at the end of the school year, those first graders, and then what the test scores and attendance for the children in her classroom now at the beginning of the school year. As far as reflecting on Standard 2, instructional capacity, promoting academic success, these are the things that I feel like I looked at when looking through this case study. To continue to create a safe environment for all the children, I think that is one of the #1 priorities. To have a homeschool relationship so that parents can come to the school and voice their complaints. Unfortunately, I don't think that the teacher responded to all of them very well, but it sounds like that is something that I think is important. Continue of supervision of staff. The teacher did go in and, you know, look at what was happening in the school and didn't see anything. And I do believe that as the teacher is removed and having a substitute there, you still need to go and supervise that staff and be in the room. Work collaboratively with school community, letting the school community know what has happened, letting the superintendent, Board of Education, families, everybody know what has happened in this situation, with confidential, giving them just basic information, but to know that Mrs. Horton is gone for the time being, and that you kind of will go from there. Promoting personal well-being of all students. I feel like the principal is being involved in everything. I think then too, next, the principal needs to continue to be involved in the actions that have been taken. I think the principal needs to be in the classroom after when the sub is in there, so that the kids have somebody in there that is familiar to them and they feel safe. Relationship building with families. I think it's important to hear the family's concerns and communicating with parents and being able to do the parent-teacher conferences, and then letting families know that there is open communication and that this is kind of what has happened in this situation. And of course, confidentiality, because you still want to build trust with your teachers, and you want to have trust with Mrs. Horton to know that she, you know, once she has taken her leave of absence, and depending on the situation and when she will be able to come back, you want to still have that trust with her so that she knows that she can come to you and that she is still in a trusting school environment. As far as enhancing instructional capacity, I think that one of the things learning in this case study is that the principal wanted to do new learning programs, and throughout all of this, will continue to enforce new learning programs, and in the first grade, continuing to do the new learning programs that they are familiar with. So the sub would need to be familiar with those programs or learn the programs. And the kids would have individualized learning, being in the classroom, being involved as the principal, doing those walkthroughs, making sure all of the students are learning and engaging, and making sure that the clear mission and key principles is known to everyone. Board of Education, superintendent, of course, would know that, parents and things, so that you're sticking by your mission and key principles when there is something going on in a school. And continuing to monitor school progress or student progress after the teacher has been removed for a leave of absence and the sub is in there, you monitoring school progress to make sure that the students are continuing to progress. And here is the reference on the case study.